Now we move to Samia Akhter-Khan. Samia is a PhD student at the University of King's College in London. She's in an early career, but I have to say she's a very well-known researcher on loneliness. Everybody you talk to, they know their work, her work. She has done very critical papers in loneliness, and that's why we invited her. I met her in the BSG, the British Gerontological Association, last year in the UK. So, and she has a paper with this title. That's why the conference, her speech has this title, and we were looking forward to listen your answer. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction. Buen dia a todos. Really happy to be here today and talk about loneliness, which we already got a little introduction to today. So my talk has 3 parts. First, I'll talk about why loneliness interventions are not as successful as we want them to be, which I call the problem. Then I will introduce a new loneliness theory, the social relationship expectations framework, which we recently developed, which could be a new approach to the problem. And third, I'll give an example of some of my more global research. This is from Thailand, a participatory intervention for loneliness with Myanmar migrants, which could be a solution. We'll see. So starting with the first problem, why loneliness aren't as successful, loneliness interventions. So first of all, we need to understand what loneliness actually is and why it's a problem and why we want to find interventions to loneliness. So loneliness is a risk factor for developing depression, stroke, cardiovascular diseases, mortality, and dementia. And we recently published several papers with the Framingham Heart Study in Boston, where we see that persistent loneliness, so feeling lonely several times within multiple years, actually led to a double increase of developing dementia and Alzheimer's disease compared to people who didn't feel lonely. However, when we look at people who felt lonely and then didn't feel lonely like 2 years later, so like this transient kind of loneliness, we found that it was a protective factor. So we really need to look at these different chronicities, basically, of loneliness and how long we feel lonely for. Current interventions are often described as improved but not recovered. So we see that interventions so small to moderate effect sizes, this is quite an old meta-analysis from 2012, but it's still one of the most broad or comprehensive ones by Mazi and colleagues. There's a recent WHO gap map that shows what interventions we have, what digital interventions we have for loneliness. And the conclusion is basically that evaluations are of low quality, and they also don't reach countries in the global south or low middle income countries. We also know from many reviews that one-size-fits-all approaches will not work for loneliness because it's such a complex problem. And that's basically what we're talking, or what we wrote in this paper, is why loneliness interventions are unsuccessful. And that's what I'm going to go into detail here now. So when we think about loneliness as a complex issue, it's important to think about what loneliness is not. So loneliness is not the same as social isolation. That means it's not just physically being alone. That's why it's also not objectively measurable. So we can't just say, okay, this person is lonely, this person isn't, but it really depends on your own subjective experience. It's also not a clinical disorder. So it's not something like depression. It's not something we have symptoms for, or like where that we can tick off and say, okay, this person is now lonely or not. It's also not necessarily a permanent state. So what I talked about earlier, this transient and persistent loneliness. So you might feel lonely in certain situations only, or certain days. So some people from my research only felt lonely at night when they thought about their relationships, and then didn't feel lonely during the day. It's also not an older people's problem. I think there's just went into detail on that. So loneliness is prevalent across the lifespan, especially in younger age. And it's also not only prevalent in higher income countries. I think we often have a perception of individualism that leads to loneliness, and our society, the way it's built, that leads to loneliness. But actually loneliness is very prevalent as well in all around the world, especially in lower middle income countries. And I'll talk more about that later. So what are the pitfalls of one-size-fits-all approaches? So what is loneliness actually? So we have different dimensions of loneliness. So we have a social dimension, which is more like the quantity or the disappointment in our quantity of relationships. We have an emotional dimension of loneliness. So having these different dimensions of loneliness, maybe different interventions work for different dimensions of loneliness. So if we have like this lack of quality in relationships, maybe a certain kind of interventions will work for emotional loneliness, but not for social loneliness, and vice versa. So we need to identify what is the right solution for what type of loneliness. Taking a social needs perspective on loneliness from like the 80s is really necessary to look at contextual factors. So, for example, getting an AD, so Alzheimer's and dementia diagnosis, you might have different needs for your relationships than moving to a long-term care facility. So at different points in this process of Alzheimer's and dementia, we might need different things from our relationships. So receiving a diagnosis, we might need more of this emotional support versus moving to a long-term care facility. We might need more people visiting us and like this proximity of our family members. So this leads to the point of the right person. So for whom does the intervention work? If we are in different parts of our lifespan, but also in different contexts of like developing a disease in later life, we might need different interventions that work for different people in different contexts. Now, the next part is the right time, and this is a really tricky one. So again, talking about transient versus chronic loneliness, but also when does loneliness become a burden? Because loneliness can be something positive because it may motivate us to re-engage in our social connections and relationships, but it may also be a burden. But current scales don't measure really when does loneliness actually become a burden, and when do we intervene? When do we need to intervene? So when are we bothered by this feeling of loneliness? And how can we measure this kind of burden, but also the motivation to change the state? So these are important questions we need to ask ourselves when we actually evaluate interventions. So what I'm saying is interventions are not necessarily unsuccessful per se, but they might not be targeted or integrated well enough to tailor them to the individual needs. So having the right solution for the right person at the right time is really that tricky thing that needs to be done. And here we see the different micro, meso, and macro levels, which we talked about, or we heard about in the introduction already of this conference, so that there are different interventions that might work for different levels that we are in. So more like on the very personal level, where we might experience emotional loneliness, maybe psychoeducation, psychotherapy interventions might work for that part. But then for the more social loneliness on the meso level, we might need more buddy programs or activities where we are connected with other people. And very importantly for loneliness, the macro level, so looking at the social determinants of health, of poverty, of health, of different demographic risk factors that we can address within campaigns to end loneliness, like the campaign in the UK. So just having this very complex network of which intervention works for whom at what time is just really important when we look at interventions. Now, what works? So what is actually successful? Here's just a little overview of a systematic review by Morish and colleagues that look at active ingredients of successful interventions for loneliness. So what interventions that were successful had in common. And one of the things was that there needs to be an interaction with other participants between the sessions of the interventions. There need to be clear learning mechanisms in the intervention. Active participation, and I think that's something I'll talk about in the third part of participants is really necessary to be successful. There needs to be group and facilitator interaction, so not just giving somebody an intervention and letting them be, but there needs to be this interaction between them. And different diverse teaching and learning styles, so using audiovisual material and just different styles to teach and learn. Also, many reviews have called for theory-based interventions, so really seeing that interventions that are based on theory are actually more successful, not just in the field of loneliness. So moving on to the next part, so theory-based interventions. What theories do we have for loneliness, and how can we maybe identify a new approach or something that we can base our interventions on? And I'll here introduce the Social Relationship Expectations Framework, and I'll call it SRE framework for the rest of the presentation. So we heard about what loneliness is not, but now we'll define what loneliness is. Loneliness results from the gap between expected and actual social relationships, or the discrepancy between what we expect from relationships and what we actually have in reality. We call this the core mechanism of loneliness. So we have certain expectations, we have certain relationships, and we praise those relationships, and then it may lead to loneliness if we are disappointed. Now, the problem here is that this typical definition of loneliness, this cognitive definition, is often isolated and not really embedded into contextual factors. But as we heard before, we need the lifespan approach, we need contextual factors, we need more broader structural factors such as migration, displacement, poverty, and how these affects the core mechanism of loneliness. What are our motives, how are our coping strategies, how do they change across the lifespan, and then resulting in either chronic or transient loneliness. Now, in this theory, we really asked ourselves, what do we actually expect from our relationships? What is it that we are disappointed in? What is it that we expect? And there are four expectations that are really well known in the literature and also in interventions, which are proximity. So we want to have social contacts available, support. So we want to feel cared for and able to rely on others, intimacy. So really feeling close and understood to others and by others, and fun. So sharing interests and enjoyable experiences. But then we identified two expectations from our own research, but also from the literature, especially in the Global South, which is generativity. So having opportunities to contribute meaningfully, which my previous speakers also talked about before, and respect. So feeling valued and actively included. So not just contributing, but also feeling seen for the contributions we have. And this framework is really trying to put these two expectations that maybe become more prominent in old age, generativity and respect, more in the foreground for interventions, but also for scales of loneliness. So we applied this framework to several papers with qualitative work, and one of them was Loneliness in Low and Middle Income Countries, a systematic review of qualitative data, where we wanted to know what loneliness actually is and how it's defined in different countries around the world. We included 24 studies with 15 countries from 6 geographical regions, and surprise, 50% of the studies were with older people or conducted with older people. And this is just an example. I'll not go into detail. We didn't have enough time to look at what loneliness actually meant in these countries, but this is just one example of how we can see how the SRE can be applied to qualitative data, where we actually extracted these expectations in every country. So what do people expect from our relationships in certain contexts, and how do these expectations change according to contextual factors? And here you can extract advantages, or like how can you actually fulfill your social relationship expectations, but also barriers. So what are the problems? Why can't we fulfill our expectations? And we extracted top five basically contextual factors that really affected the barriers to fulfilling our expectations. And that was one, poverty and socioeconomic status. So really people who had financial problems couldn't fulfill their expectations for various reasons. The second was stigma, so that included ageism, racism, like any kind of stigma you can find in the world. We had everything in these studies. Health, cultural ideas about aging, so expecting what does the culture expect of older people, and if we don't fulfill this role, what happens then? And migration and displacement. So this just shows you how you can, first of all, apply a theoretical framework like the SRE to qualitative data, but then also what are the contextual factors and really the importance of structural factors for feeling lonely. And now I'll move on to the third part, which is Photo Voice, a participatory intervention study with Myanmar migrants in Thailand. And this is basically really based on the SRE framework and what we know from all these contextual factors, but also from active participation and what works in interventions. So what we wanted to try is use Photo Voice as an intervention for loneliness. Some of you may be familiar with learning with photo voice, but I'll just briefly explain what it is. So as the name says, it's combining photography with narrative data, so with speech. And you can use this method to really convey life experiences, expertise, and knowledge to their community, to society, or also on the policy level. So it is a participatory action research method or power method, but there are different possible stages of participation. So if you look at participation generally in research, it's mostly contractual. So we just have certain questions as researchers. We go to a community, we want answers, and then we expect answers from our participants. But it can also be consultative. So we can also ask our participants about their opinions on the research or on the findings. And going next to the next stage, it can also be that researchers and local people really work together on a project, but the power or control over the research still lies with the researcher. And then collegiate is like the highest form of participation in research, is where really the control over the research process is given to the participants, and they really engage in this research project as active agents. And yeah, so I would say this PhotoVoice project definitely had stages of all these 4 stages, but was more on the collaborative collegiate side. So what are the core components of PhotoVoice? Usually they're group workshops where participants learn how to use photography. So in this case, it was older adults who had never used a camera before. And so you need an introduction to just the basic camera. So this is the camera we used. It was actually a children's camera, so very easy to use. And then you have different tasks along the way of each workshop where you explain not only the use of the camera, but also ethical issues. So what if you take photos of maybe somebody who just stole something, or you have like evidence of something bad? How do you deal with that? And you also practice communication skills, because it's not only about taking photos, but it's also about conveying your message. Why did you take that image? What do you want to say with this image? And that's something where you can really learn to listen to other people in the group, but also use different techniques to convey your message. Then another big or important component of PhotoVoice are individual interviews, which usually happen later, where you really help participants caption their photos and choose the photos they want to show to the public if they want to show them. Whether or not to have an exhibition is usually, or in this case, was the decision by my participants in the group. But sometimes it's also just a core component of PhotoVoice to exhibit the photos. And of course, an evaluation, like every good project. So what did we do? We had a 6-week PhotoVoice project in northern Thailand, so at the border to Myanmar. And we had to do this project there because of the military coup in Myanmar. So we had to change the project from Myanmar to Thailand, and then worked with Myanmar migrants in Southeast Asia. The project went over 6 weeks. So we had 5 weeks of workshops and 1 evaluation at the end, plus an exhibition. And we used this PhotoVoice study as an intervention for loneliness to see whether participants would actually feel reduced loneliness later on. So we recruited only people who felt lonely according to the Deangirpa loneliness scale, which we adapted to Burmese before. And then we assessed the scale again after 6 weeks to see pre-post comparison, but also more importantly, because this was rather a feasibility study, to look at the qualitative elements of perceived loneliness, reduced loneliness, have a group discussion about the whole project, and also public engagement feedback. Here you just see a little timeline of what happened when, but also how much control was with me, basically as a researcher, but how much control was also with the participants. So we started with ethics approval and funding, which was more on my side because it was my PhD project. So I didn't involve any participants before I actually applied for funding and ethical approval for practical reasons. And then when I came to Thailand, I was looking for a co-facilitator to do this project with me because I wanted to co-produce the study with an older person. So previously I had conducted focus groups in that area, and then one of the focus group participants agreed to participate and be a co-facilitator for this project. And you see a photo here. This is Elu. She's 60 years old, also a migrant from Myanmar, and has been living in Thailand for almost 20 years. And she wanted to do this project with me. So then we met up with potential participants in the community and had initial meetings to discuss what the project is about, but also what are concerns in the community. So what were worries, what were ethical concerns, such as political and security concerns, because some participants still had family in Myanmar or wanted to return to Myanmar once the border opened, and were worried that we would talk about political issues. So this is a highly sensitive conflict setting, of course, that we are very close to and worked with. Then we went to consent and screening. So really having community health volunteers help us screen for loneliness. And then we selected participants. We didn't have many older people in this community, so almost all older people who felt lonely participated also, which were 9 people in the end. We had 5 weekly workshops, 1 interview, and then participants decided to have an exhibition with the photos. We had a qualitative and quantitative evaluation, and then the dissemination, which is what's happening right now, is more me and not my participants from Thailand who had a hard time flying here. Okay, I'll briefly talk about the exhibition. So participants decided to have it in a local shoe factory, and here you see little postcards on the table where people who came to the exhibition could fill out questions about what they learned about older people, how that changed their perception about older migrants from Myanmar, and how they found the exhibition. We invited local NGOs, public health officers, lecturers, and students from the university. So we had Thai and Myanmar audiences, which made it pretty difficult because we had to translate everything from Burmese, translate everything from Burmese to Thai, and then later to English as well for an international exhibition within a very short amount of time. This core element of this exhibition was about care and what care actually means to older people and how they provide care. So really focusing on generativity and this aspect of really engaging meaningfully. And here's just one photo as an example where you can see that older people provide a lot of care. So she says, in Thailand, we have to take care of ourselves to prevent this and that from happening. We're taking care of our health, mostly in this country. If we, who come from Myanmar, do not take care of ourselves, no one cares for us. Children are not free because of their jobs. We cannot rely on them. They take care of their jobs only. We have to take care of our health, how we should live, and what we should do. So there you just see this real responsibility within older people themselves to take care of themselves, but also of others, and not receiving this reciprocal support from the outside. Here's some photos from the exhibition, where you see some of the participants, but also public health officers who looked at the photos. Here are just some examples from the public engagement feedback, so what people wrote in the postcards who came up to the exhibition. For example, as Thai people, we should respect and help those who are always away from home, as well as develop an approach to more interconnection and encouragement. So really seeing, okay, there are these problems that migrants particularly experience in this community, older people, but also this awareness for really including social dimensions of health when looking at how to treat older people in the health sector. Now, looking at the quantitative results, obviously this is keeping in mind this is only 9 participants. We saw a reduction in loneliness from around 8 to 6 points in the total score, but specifically in the social aspect, the social dimension of loneliness, we saw a reduction in loneliness. But then more important for us to evaluate this project was the qualitative aspect of how participants experienced this project and how it could reduce loneliness of photo voice as a method. First of all, we found from the group discussions that photo voice can reduce loneliness as photography really facilitates opening up to people about important things in life. So it started from very easy tasks such as, oh, how can I use this button? Can you help me? And participants engaged with very simple questions and then opened up to more important or more personal aspects of life in the group discussions. So they said they would get closer to communicating on how to shoot photos, ask each other what is what, but without a camera, it's hard to get friendly. And one person said, I'm not learning any longer because I have a companions to unburden my feelings. We were less likely to open our hearts before we became close. And this is just to say participants knew each other before, but they never really connected as well because they were from different ethnicities or came from different regions in Myanmar. So they also had like communication problems sometimes. Having found new friends that care for each other and making close connections to people is really one outcome. So they said they're getting along now. We look after each other in every condition. For instance, we asked M₃O to go and see M₃O when she was not feeling well, but previously we were not likely to pay a visit to someone or accompany each other. Now we're encouraging each other, sharing and chatting all the time. So really, one person said they found friends for life. So really having this connection, new friends from the group. Then looking at this other aspect of respect and generativity, the exhibition really made people feel young, valued, and respected. So here's a quote by one woman who provided a lot of care to her grandchildren, but didn't really feel valued or seen for this care, and showed this in the exhibition. And here she said, after reading the postcards, we know how to take care of children, care about household duties. We do everything starting from cooking, but we are not being paid for these jobs. When children came to realize that we have done a lot for them, here on these postcards, they show their tenderness in return. So basically this exhibition, or this photo voice with the exhibition, managed to target all the 6 expectations. So having proximity, so being close to people and having contacts available that were maybe before they were there, but they were not really available to them. Feeling cared for, so having support in difficult times, also outside of the intervention, being able to go to someone's home and help them or be helped. Feeling close and understood and listened to was really, I think, one of the core parts of this intervention, because there are certain cultural ideas or concepts in Burmese or also in Thailand, in Thai, like anare and klengjai, which really is like not wanting to open up because of a burden you put on someone. So you don't want to burden someone else. So you just step back and maybe don't tell them how you may feel bad or what problems you have. So I think this group really overcame this kind of anare, this concept to really be close to someone and really be able to open up to someone about problems. Of course, fun. They had a lot of fun at the exhibition, also taking the photos, learning something new. And then generativity, the whole exhibition was about care and how older people provide care to society. But also one participant said, oh, I'm helping you with your PhD. So I'm really contributing to your future and also to science in general. So having that aspect of generativity as me, as like a younger researcher. And respect, so through its exhibition and the public engagement feedback, people really felt respected and seen and valued. So that's one way how this exhibition really targeted these aspects. And here again, we have a little pathway maybe to reduce loneliness and how these different elements of photography, the exhibition, and the public engagement component really led to reduced loneliness among participants. So first of all, photography really showing how do we provide care, what are our problems, how are we disappointed in our social contacts, using the camera and using photography. Then the exhibition visitors, they learned about older people's social relationship expectations, and they gave feedback by changing their expectations as well about older people. And then the public engagement component really helped participants see that there was a change that was evoked. So really having this action component, we changed something in this community, but we also changed something in Thai people who view us differently now, and feeling seen and respected. Yeah, briefly want to share this video. It's around 5 minutes before I conclude with the presentation. It should be here.
Pematian Candidate Samia Akhter-Khan သင်ခန်းစာလည်းရတယ်ပညာလည်းရတယ်ဒီလိုဖွဲ့စည်းတဲ့ဒီအလုပ်ကိုလုပ်တာအရန်လဲအံ့ဩတယ်အရန်လဲကျေးဇူးတင်တယ်ပြောဖို့လည်းအရန်ကောင်းတယ်ဒီစကားတွေနားမလည်တဲ့ပညာတွေပြန်ပြီးတော့တတိရတယ်ပြန်ပြီးတော့ပညာအသစ်တစ်ခုရတယ်လို့ပဲတပီးတို့အများကြီးကျေးဇူးတင်တယ်
ကျမတို့ဒီဆီယာမနဲ့ငါးပတ်တာဆွေးနွေးနေတဲ့အတော်အတွင်းမှာကျမတို့အတွက်ပျော်ရွှင်မှုတွေလည်းရပါတယ်ဘဝတုတ္တလည်းရပါတယ်အခုဆိုလို့ရှိရင်တောင်းတဲ့တယောက်အရင်မသိကြဘူးဂယုမဆိုင်မိကြဘူးအခုတော့အဖိုးဖွားတွေတစုတဝေးကြီးပဲစူးစီးပြီးတော့ပို့ပြီးတော့လည်းရင်းနှီးလာတယ်ပို့ပြီးတော့လည်းခင်မင်ပါတယ်ပျော်စရာကတော့အကုန်လုံးတွေ့ပြီးတော့မှအကုန်လုံးတွေ့ဆုံရတဲ့အတွက်တပတ်တစ်ခါပျော်ရွှင်ပါတယ်ပျော်ပါတယ်ဓာတ်ပုံလူရက်ချင်တယ်ဆိုရင်လည်းခွင်းတောင်းပြီးရိုက်လို့ရပါတယ်သားသမီးလေးတွေလူလေးတွေကိုလည်းထည့်ရပါတယ်တက်ကြီးရွယ်အိုတွေအတွက်နောက်ဆုံးပိတ်အခွင့်အရေးလို့လည်းခံစားမိတယ်
ကျမတို့အခုလို့လာတွေ့ရတယ်နော်ဝန်တာပါတယ်အားလုံးလာပြီးတော့အထောက်အကူတွေတော့အကြံပေးဉာဏ်ပေးနော်ဘုဟုတုတ္တလည်းဖြစ်တယ်ပေါ့အားလုံးလူတက်ကြီးရွယ်အိုတွေအားလုံးဘုဟုတုတ္တလည်းဖြစ်တယ်တွေ့ကြုံလည်းရှိတယ်အကြမြင်လည်းရှိတယ်ပေါ့အားလုံးအရှင်ပြေပါတယ်လို့ပြောတဲ့သိကြည်နူးတယ်ဘာပဲလုပ်လို့အရှင်ပြေတယ်ပြန်ကောင်းတယ်လေးထပ်ဖို့ရိုက်တဲ့အချိန်ကိုကြိုက်ရိုက်
ဒီမှာအဲ့လိုလာဆရာမလေးအဲ့လိုလာပြီးလုပ်ပြီးတော့ကျွန်တော်လည်းဘုတုတ္တလေးတော့ရတယ်ဘောလည်းမတာပါတယ်ကျွန်တော်လည်းပြောရတယ်
သမီးလာလို့ပဲဒီတဘောရတော့ဒီသမီးလာတဲ့အတွက်ကြောင့်အတွေ့အကြုံလည်းများတာတော့
သမီးလေးတို့ဆရာမတို့ဒီကိုလာပြီးတော့ခုလိုလောက်တာအားပေးတာပျော်စရာကောင်းတယ်အရန်ကိုစိတ်ပျော်ရွှင်လို့
ဘာပြောချင်လဲဆိုတော့ဒီလိုဖွဲ့စည်းနေလောက်ရတာပျော်လည်းပျော်ပါတယ်ဘဟုတုတ္တလည်းရတယ်နော်ကိုကအလုံးနဲ့အိမ်နဲ့လှုပ်ဆိုတော့ဒီမှာကိုအပေါင်းအသင်းနဲ့တွေ့တဲ့ခါကျတော့စိတ်ပျော်ရွှင်သွားတာပေါ့ခဏတာပန်းပြေသွားတာပေါ့အကုန်လုံးလည်းဘဟုတုတ္တလည်းရပါတယ်ကိုမသိတဲ့အရာတွေဆိုတော့တယောက်နဲ့တယောက်မျှဝေပြီးတော့အဆင်ပြေတယ်ပေါ့နော်ကိုအသက်ကြီးတဲ့လူတွေချင်းချင်းဆိုတော့ပျော်စရာလည်းကောင်းတာပေါ့
ဒီခုရှာမှနဲ့တွေ့မှတဲ့ကျွန်တော်တို့လူဦးတွေကဘယ်လိုပညာပေးလို့ဘာမှမတိနားမလဲတဲ့အဖိုးတွေကပညာလာပေးပါဒါမှနောက်ကျန်တဲ့ဒီလိုထပ်ပေးလို့တော့ပါတယ်
ประทับใจที่มีนิทรรศการแบบนี้เกิดขึ้นเพราะว่าอย่างคนไทยเนี้ยเราก็ไม่เคยได้ทำอะไรแบบนี้เท่าไหร่อันนี้ก็จะเป็นนิทรรศการแรกๆที่เคยมาดูค่ะ
တက်ကြီးရဲ့ကိုဒီလိုလုပ်ပေးအတွက်ဘုဟုတုတ္တရဲ့လည်းအများကြီးရပါတယ်ပြီးတော့ပျော်လည်းပျော်ပါတယ်တက်ကြီးရဲ့ကိုငင်းငင်းညံ့ညံ့နဲ့အနာလည်းယူစေချင်ပါတယ်သားသမီးတွေလည်းမိဘပေါ်တိတက်တဲ့သားသမီးကောင်းများဖြစ်ကြပါစေ
นั่งอยู่คนเดียวถามว่าบางวันเขาก็มีเพื่อนบางคนเขาก็ไม่มีเพื่อนอยากหาเพื่อนคุยเขาอยู่บ้านคนเดียวเขาบอกว่ารอลูกหลานกลับจากที่ทำงานก็ค่อยจะมีเพื่อนหรือว่ารอเพื่อนข้างบ้านกลับมาจากที่ทำงานเนี่ยเขาจะได้พูดคุยกับเพื่อน
จะเป็นชนชาติไหนไทยอะไรยังไงบ้านที่ไหนก็จะมีความรู้สึกที่คล้ายกันเหมือนกันก็จะมีความรักบ้างรักในบ้านรักในวัฒนธรรมรักในชีวิตที่เคยดำรงอยู่มาไม่ว่าตัวอยู่ที่ไหนความใส่ใจซึ่งกันและกันเนาะความเอื้อเฟื้อเผื่อแผ่ก็ยังคงมีให้ได้ทุกคนไม่ว่าจะอยู่ที่ไหนอะไรยังไงก็ถือก็ยังมีให้แล้วก็มีการถ่ายทอดประสบการณ์ความรู้อะไรที่ได้ของเราเนี่ยให้กับผู้อื่นต่อให้ลูกให้หลานให้คนใกล้เคียงนะคะก็ทำให้เรามองในจุดนี้เพิ่มขึ้นเนาะในมิติของสุขภาพน้องมิติสุขภาพไม่ใช่ว่าเจ็บป่วยแค่นั้นเราก็ยังจะมองถึงสภาพแวดล้อมด้วยความเป็นอยู่ความรู้สึกลึกๆหรือพื้นฐานเดิมในชีวิตก็มีผลกับสุขภาพ
ไม่ได้ส่วนตัวนะคะก็คือที่เห็นว่าภาพถ่ายมาคือเราจะมองด้วยตาแต่บางอย่างถ้ามันถ่ายออกมาแล้วมันให้ความรู้สึกที่มันเป็นอีกแบบนึงเนาะแล้วก็ประจวบกับการเขียนคำบรรยายมันทำให้ภาพมีความหมายมากมันสามารถเล่าเรื่องราวต่างๆได้มากมายอย่างกรณีนี้ก็เหมือนกันบางครั้งเรายังไม่รู้ว่าหมายถึงอะไรแต่เขาก็ยังมีความรู้และสามารถเอามาดูแลตัวเองได้ในภาพก็สามารถสื่อความหมายได้แล้วก็ทำให้เราเข้าใจความรู้สึกของเขาได้มากขึ้น
ไม่เคยจะคิดในมุมนี้เลย
ใช่
ขอบคุณนะคะขอบคุณที่ถ่ายทอดแลกเปลี่ยนสิ่งเหล่านี้ออกมา
มันทำให้เห็นมีบรรยากาศหนึ่งในชุมชนขอบคุณมาก
Yeah, thank you. So this video you can
Este ex ingeniero de la NASA
this ad you can look you can watch on YouTube. So just to conclude a few things. So if you want to look at the exhibition, we also have an online exhibition. So we put all the photos and the captions up on the Rebuilding Care Network at Duke, and you can find it under this link to really see the contents of the photos. It's really interesting and really great photos that came out of the this project. And looking forward, I would just like to conclude that loneliness is a complex issue that is personal and structural. And I think we often neglect these structural factors such as poverty. We also heard it in the first presentation. So adequate interventions really need to address both components. We need more research and intervention development in low and middle income countries and by low and middle income scholars as well. So also directing more funding and interest towards this, because loneliness is a problem. It's a global problem. It's really prevalent everywhere, especially where there is poverty. And we need theory-based participatory interventions, so really letting people participate in the experience, actively participate, but also having some kind of theory that explains the development of the intervention. So one question that I think future research can more look into is how can people actually contribute meaningfully? So having this aspect of generativity and feel valued and respected for the care they provide. Yep. Thank you very much. Here's some references.